question down here in the front. Yeah, please.
Hi, Shane Farrell from Business Insider. I'm wondering what effect this has on Mexico and the economy. I know that it was like growing pretty well, but lately GDP estimates for 2015 have kind of slowly been going down. And I'm wondering if this sort of has the same effect as on the US, and it's going to sort of pick up.
So a colleague of mine who is an authority on Mexico and I did a study that actually came out last week. There's a 2-page summary of it on people's tables, and the full thing is available online, on the impact of falling oil prices on Mexico. We started this about a year or so ago and finished it up a lot more quickly than we planned when oil prices started to collapse. So there are 2 separate questions. One is about the real economy. And Mexico has seen headwinds for a variety of reasons, but it has diversified its economy enormously in the last 10 or 20 years. And so we don't see as large vulnerability to the overall economy. There are questions about future production growth, and I think Mike pointed to those before, that will affect growth, but more broadly, you see, first, this is a smaller part of the economy, but second, Mexico's economy is driven in substantial part by trade with the United States, by trade with Asia, and all of this is going to pick up as a result of lower oil prices. So these other economies will be stronger, and therefore Mexico will have a larger export market. So this is the sort of real economy side of things. Then there's the government. Government is a different story. Government gets about 30% of its spending covered by money it takes from Pemex, from the National Oil Company, and that's not going to be substantially diversified until, let's say, the 2020s. This is still, even as they do their reforms, this is going to take time. You see a lot of estimates out there, and there's a Moody's report recently that sort of says, not such a big problem, they're hedged. Right? Mexico sells put options that hedge its exposure to oil prices. It did that relatively late in the year as prices were falling, so it's pretty well protected. But those put options last for a year. And after that year, they're not there. And this gets back to this original discussion about how long does this last and how low does it go. And what we found when we looked at it was that, yeah, if you look at 1 year, things are relatively okay. If prices stay low for a sustained period, for a few years, Mexico faces much more difficult trade-offs. And in particular, it has to make a decision about how it handles debt. In principle, you can cover these shortfalls, particularly if you think they're temporary, by issuing additional debt. And Mexico has a relatively low debt burden, right? 40% of GDP or so. This is much lower than most other countries. But Mexico has also had a very careful adherence to almost balanced budgets. And while you can do a sort of basic analysis that says, well, if you add a percentage point of GDP worth of debt to a year to Mexico's debt, this isn't a big thing in the grand scheme of things. It may be that bond markets think that this is a fundamental difference, that sticking to your rules is one thing and violating them is something else, even if in the grand scheme of things the numbers seem small. And either that can turn out to be true, or the government can say we don't want to test that, in which case they have to make changes to revenue and spending. Revenue changes take time. A lot of spending is baked in, and so you end up having to focus on relatively small pieces where you have a large impact with your cuts. Put on top of this that the Mexican government is busy with some other things right now and has some other institutional problems, has public safety problems, and something that might seem relatively small if you look at it purely in economic terms can have broader consequences.
I'll just add a couple of bright spots. Mexico has been spending increasingly a lot on its own domestic oil needs. So its domestic consumption has been rising very quickly, partly because of its manufacturing base, but also the middle class growth and the kind of boom in transportation in Mexico. That actually they'll get a break on that. So the other thing I'd say though is that it's hard to underestimate. It's very easy to underestimate how much of Mexico's economic fortunes are attached to the United States. I think it's still somewhere in the nature of 72 to 75% of it's a very large percentage of economic activity. And let's face it, the U.S. is looking as rosy as it's looked in quite a while. I think that's an interesting, there's also interesting incentives for the United States to make sure that things work out in Mexico, not only because of NAFTA, but because of the potential of a new kind of 90s level surge of immigration, which is not exactly what the U.S. political landscape needs right now.